Hey, 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 hey!
It's about to get crazy. It's about to go down. It's about to get crazy. It's gonna be loud. This is our house. We do what we wanna. We'll blow the roof up. Everybody's coming. It's about to get crazy. It's about to go down. It's about to go down.
You are listening to the Gritty Podcast, where we talk about all things gritty. Life is not easy. Life isn't fair. It never was, and it never will be. A good life takes grit, because the best things in life come from hard work, sacrifice, resolve, determination, and perseverance. Because grit means never quitting. It means coming back time and time again until you succeed. So on this show, we talk hunting, we talk outdoors, we talk conservation, we talk family and life. We talk fitness, and we talk strength, strength of body, strength of mind, and strength of character. Prioritize who you are and who you want to be. Get gritty, because life isn't fair, and a little grit can make all the difference. All right, folks, welcome to the Gritty Podcast. We're coming at you from the studio here in Salt Lake City. It's actually Fruit Lane. Fruit Heights.
I said Fruit Lane.
Yes. And I'm here.
Fruity Lane.
Yeah.
You're in the Fruity Lane.
This morning, I was fortunate to have to go on a hike with two public land advocates, leaders in this space. My good friend Ty Stubblefield with Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, chapter coordinator in New Chapter Development.
Correct.
And Land Tawney, CEO, Presidente. Is that how you say it?
El Presidente.
El Presidente of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. And we have our good friend Brian Mcelrea from Hushin here as well. And we're all four passionate public land advocates. And it's great to be here today because I wanna push this public land message. And it seems like it's constantly under attack. And here I have just moved into the state of Utah. I'll be a full-fledged resident soon, and there's a hotbed of what did you say, Brian, earlier? About?
So my analogy was that if there was going to be a Mount Rushmore of public land grabbers, there would be a lot of faces to etch in stone right out of good old Utah.
Exactly. So we have some work to cut out for us in promoting and discussing this public land issue that's before us. And so today we're going to get into that, some of this stuff. And I want to thank you all for being here and for everything that you do for public lands. Ty mentioned offline before we started that the definition of public land is somewhat under question. You know, it's a little confusing. So we're going to dive into that first. Ty, you want to start it off?
Yeah, my analogy of our public lands, be it federal, BLM or Forest Service, it's like this big pie, and everybody wants a piece of that pie. And so often you hear, well, they're mismanaging our public lands. What does that mean? What do you mean mismanaging? To you, mismanaging might be different to me. Like I might think that it's managed perfectly because, maybe I have this OHV park, that I go ride and I love it. It's great.
What's an OHV park?
Off-highway vehicles, four-wheel drive, four-wheelers, side-by-sides, dirt bikes, snowmobiles. Yeah. And so that's like one piece of the pie. And then you have your mountain bikers and you have your hikers and, you have your
climbers,
hunters and your fishermen and
huckleberry pickers.
Exactly. Yeah. All the gamuts of uses of our public lands and consequently all the values that those public lands bring. Like it's a pie and we all want our little piece. And so one group might think that, well, it's mismanaged because another group got their way. And Land says it all the time, like nobody gets their way, everything that they want. We all have to give a little bit.
Okay. And
so that's what we have to make people understand. This isn't just about you. It's about all of us because it's public land from people from New York to, San Francisco and everywhere in between. And that's where the local, a lot of the local folks that live in and around those federal lands, they feel like, oh, well, the guys in New York shouldn't have a say on how this is managed here where I live. They're paying their taxes too, and they want to be able to come out here and use them just as much as we do. And so we forget about that all the time.
Well, let's talk about that. The ownership structure of our public lands and these lands that we're talking about right now. Land, you want to kind of?
Yeah, I mean, I think we were talking about this on the hike before, and I think, a lot of people are like, oh, the feds own that. And I think, that's what separates this country from every other country in the world, is that we, the people, own the 640 million acres. And like Ty said, whether that's, Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, like refuge lands, national parks, we own that. And then it's up to the federal government to manage that, for us. And that's the sticky things I think that, that Ty talks about. It's that pie. I mean, I would say that some people want the whole pie. When they don't get the whole pie, they're like, this stuff is mismanaged, and I think that's a lot of times extractive industry where you have to, think about different things. But really that ownership lies with us. And I think at a state level, then that's owned by the state. And, a lot of state trust lands, they're there to create revenue. And so they don't care necessarily about the huckleberry picking and the kayaking and the mountain biking and the hunting and the fishing, because they have to generate money out of that. Now there are like wildlife management areas that I think we've all hunted that are state owned. But again, those are state owned, very regulated. The state lands in Montana, you can't camp on, right?
Colorado.
In Colorado.
New Mexico.
I mean, and so there's different rules at a state level, where the federal rules are pretty much like they're pretty universal. That 14 to 16 days that you can go camp, and then you have to move. Like, we're living like kings, man, and that's our property. And I think, that's one of the things I think that a light bulb goes off all the time on people, that when they figure out that, they own 640 million acres, it's like, boom, blows their mind. And I think, that education piece, is huge. And, that started, we think about here in the West, that was us buying that from the French in the Louisiana Purchase. What an awesome deal that was for the United States. And how that's manifested now is that, the majority of our public lands are in the West, but that does not mean, there's a 1.1 million acre national forest in North Carolina, there's pockets of public land all around this country. And whether that's public lands or public waters, start thinking about marshes or beaches, there's a lot of issues around that right now. That's stuff that belongs to us too, right? And I think that big piece is that, I said it already, but like, we live like kings, and nobody, we're the envy of the world.
Yeah. Well, Brian, you want to touch on what Senator Mike Lee said, because he's spinning a yarn, the Republican senator of Utah. He's offering up this other narrative, which is utterly an utter lie. Basically, there's no way around it. It's a complete lie.
It's confusing. It doesn't make sense to me. I mean, I listened to the whole.
Describe his narrative, what he's telling the people.
He's really spinning it to where public lands are this elitist. He termed it as a royal forest, and he drew this parallel to old world, Europe and
King of England.
Yeah, and it just, his whole perception from that speech, in my opinion, was that public lands are really designed for these wealthy elite people that fly in on their private jets. They're sipping on their coffee, drinking their microbrews, coming in to visit a state park or something, or like one of the big five here in Utah, and then they leave. And so he has this kind of picture of this elitist society that's using the public lands. When, Ty and I were talking before we started, that's certainly not my perception of public lands. I mean, I've been in a lot of back road public lands in Oregon, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and I'm not seeing a lot of like elitist folks.
No.
Right? I'm seeing people just like all of us, like blue collar, regular Joes.
1984 Toyotas.
Older pickups,
It's galling to me that he would equate our collectively owned public lands, collectively owned by all U.S. citizens, that he would equate that to the King of England hoarding the lands and not letting any peasant or anyone have access to it. It's the exact opposite.
It's so far
from 180 degrees opposite.
I would really encourage anybody listening to this podcast to go waste an hour and a half of your life and listen to that speech, just so you can put it in perspective of like how just of a unique angle he's approaching this at. It's worth it, because I think you can really wrap your arms a little bit further around what his agenda is and what his goals are, and the messaging that he's using to try to get there.
The other thing that he says a lot, and you and I spoke about this morning, Ty, was he likes to use the word, the feds need to give it back.
Yeah.
As if the feds took it from the state of Utah and are exercising this tyrannical governmental control over these lands, and that Utahns deserve to have their lands back. And he really appeals to the entitlement
Yeah. And
generation that's like, hey, yeah,
his
that is
idealistic
ours.
state would be one of very little public land. So he referenced Missouri and Illinois were two that came to mind that he.
Yeah, Senator Ted
He held up
Cruz.
as examples of like, this is the way you should be doing
He said
it.
Pennsylvania too.
Yeah. So, and I believe, I don't know the percentages exactly, but they're, I think, under 5% of their land is public.
Federally managed public
Correct.
land.
And that, in his eyes, was idealistic.
And like they didn't really have state lands left, really.
Yeah.
Like they've sold almost all of their state lands that they were originally granted when they became a state. And
So I think that's an education piece because the argument of if it isn't going to be federally managed, let's control it by the states. I don't know that there's as many people that we need to have knowledge of that could really tell you what does that mean? What are the differences? Land and Ty would be much better served to explain it probably than myself. But I think that's an important piece is how different would it be if the states did manage it? What would that look like? And why is that argument coming up when people are trying to defend maybe Mike's position?
Yeah, I think so that local control sounds good, right? This is my backyard. We know better what to do. Now that they always talk about how decisions are being made out in Washington D.C. too, right? Well, I don't know about you guys, but like we're participating, in travel management plans that are on the ground, like resource management plans,
that's one argument that everybody always comes up is we don't have a voice.
Yep.
And what they don't realize are every management plan of any kind for our federal lands has a process. And that process includes public comment and public action and volunteers sitting on these, boards that you're talking about. Just to explain it to people that don't know land is people don't understand what those are. Yeah. So go into detail like what RAC is.
Well, so like a regional advisory council for like the BLM, right? Like, so this is like an area, that's a regional area that people sit on. They give advice to the BLM on how they should, be managing these things. And that runs the gamut from all sorts of different things. And so it's the citizens are involved. You're elected to that position. I think, I don't know terms necessarily on that, but you are there to serve the people and serve your interests and the people you represent. So they're trying to make sure that your voice is heard on that management. And I think
they'll have different interests on there, like cattlemen and hunters,
very diverse,
and
matches up with that pie, probably.
Exactly,
right?
Yeah, all the people that have a say in the pie. So,
but I think when people talk about how they don't have a say, it's because they didn't get exactly what they wanted, right? And so, like the travel management plan in Montana, just like south of Missoula and the Bitterroot. We put a ton of time into what we wanted there. There was snowmobilers that did the same thing. ATVers. It was a travel management plan. Did anybody get exactly what they wanted? No. But is it a path forward for people? I think so. Now, if we would have gotten everything we wanted, that would have kept out ATV users and snowmobilers. And do they have a beef then? Absolutely. Do they have a right to that? Absolutely. And so I think it's that sticky thing of dividing things up. And then versus like a state land, which is done for the highest best use. And the highest best use is
economic.
Is really economic. And I think, one, they're forgetting some economics, which is called the outdoor, economy that is not only growing but is sustainable. I think this last year, Outdoor Industry Alliance did some numbers. It was like $887 billion. That's with a B. That's stuff that that really dwarfs oil and gas development, timber. Like all those things are important though. Don't take that this way, but we're just not being counted in that same way. And I also think the ecological services, whether that's like clean air and clean water, like put a price tag on that stuff,
Right.
Like you think about as we're living in the arid West, as water becomes more and more important, do you want somebody else to either own that, right? Think about like, these lands that go for sale, like let's say the Chinese buy a bunch of our lands, which is maybe sounds a little far-fetched, but it could happen. And they own our headwaters of our water. So either that happens or you have industrial development that goes unchecked. And then you have, our water supplies are ruined. And so like, what does that clean air and clean water mean to you? But the simplicity, I think, really is from that is that we, the people, own it, at a federal level and at a state level. It's really owned by the state for the highest best use. And
so what happens in that situation where the state does own land, right? Yep. What happens if it isn't producing revenue anymore? Or maybe the economics aren't penciling out? Then what?
Great example is like the Elliott State Forest in Oregon. Thank you for the softball, by the way. Well, the Elliott State Forest in Oregon is just over 80,000 acres. It's been basically a timber producing piece of property for a long time. And then, because of some environmental lawsuits and other things, like they couldn't make as much money off of that. And so they were like, we got to sell this. And so they started this process through the land board to sell it. That's when us and others got involved, and people were like, no, we want to keep that, in public hands. And so they had to change the designation of this land, which doesn't happen very often. And I think they're in the process of still doing that. But instead of being like a school trust land, where they got to make money, that's going to change to something more like a wildlife management area. And so,
because the school trust lands is what goes back to fund
schools,
state education,
and it's
right?
mandated to do that, right? Which is not a bad thing.
Yeah.
But when they can't make the money anymore, what are they going to do? They were trying to sell it, and then the people had to stand up. And so I think that's an example of some of the things that can happen that are bad, but it's also an example of some of the good things that could happen if people get involved. Like, your voice still counts. You just got to use it.
Yeah.
These budget shortfalls that the states are generally in, every quarter, every year, they're struggling to meet, all their goals and initiatives, and they need money. And they are only able to squeeze so much money existing right now and then fund all their programs. And I feel like most of the states are just running at that ragged edge of being able to stay, being black, or they just borrow a little all the time to get by each year. And when that happens and they're sitting on land and they don't have the money to fight it in litigation, maybe to log it.
Yeah.
Right? Like, they need to use it, but it's like, well, we need to spend $500,000 to make $3 million. Well, it makes perfect sense as a businessman, right? You're like, okay, we'll spend $500,000 to make the $3 million.
Right.
Just like, you just do it. But if you don't have the $500,000, you can't make the $3 million. It's just simple mathematics. There's nothing you can do about that. So at that point, then it starts costing you each month. Then it's like, okay, the state's like, okay, if it costs us $100,000 a month, to own the land or to manage the land, or 20 grand, whatever it is, it's bleeding you dry. You don't have the $500,000 to get to the $3 million.
Right.
You end up selling it. And the states have done that
since it became states.
Which is the case with the Elliott. The Elliott was costing them over $1 million a year just to own.
Just to have.
Essentially own. And Oregon's a really good example because they had, I forget the exact number, we have it in our public land report, but it was several million acres that Oregon started with at conception, and they're down to 776,000. And 76 of that was the Elliott that they were going to sell, which they already sold off a portion of it.
Yeah.
So,
I think, so this idea is that, okay, I'm just going to kind of think about the argument too.
Yeah.
Is the argument is that we're not taking enough timber, we're not doing enough oil and gas development on federally managed public lands right now. If the states have them, we can do more, and then they'll pay for themselves, right? Like, that seems to start to make economic sense, right?
That seems to be the standard accepted, idea of how it would work.
Right. And so it's fairly simple. And so they've done these studies at a state level. The only place that penciled out where that actually worked out is here in Utah, but it was when oil was at $120 a barrel. Right. Now, we're in $60 a barrel, I think, right now, and so what happens when that's half? It goes back to the thing that you were talking about. Well, now we don't have the money. What are we going to do? We get caught holding the bag, right? And so that's when that idea of the transferring of those lands to the states starts to be just that path towards the sale of. And there's, lots of examples of that. I think, Nevada is probably the most egregious. They've sold 98% of the land that they were originally granted when they became states. And let's hear that again. When they became states, they were granted some land for them to have, right?
Millions of acres.
This isn't like the states had this land and then the feds took it from them. There's a thing called the Louisiana Purchase that was all over here in the West that the feds had. And then when these states became states, then they got some land. And, there's places like Montana where they haven't sold as much, but the examples are more on the other end where they've sold a lot. And
we've talked about this a lot on this podcast. So a lot of the listeners have that history.
Good.
Where did the state lands come from? How did they come to be? Just did that podcast with Randy Newberg. We went into that.
Awesome.
When I think about this, I'd like to put it in terms that I think many people could understand. Let's say that your rich uncle comes to you, land, and you got a modest income. And he's like, land, dude, I'm going to hook you up. I'm going to give you a $30 million home. And you're like, yes. Unfortunately, it's still got the mortgage on it.
And you got to pay the maintenance.
And so you got to pay, it's something like $5,000 a month. Okay. That's your mortgage payment. Don't worry though, because there's 3 apartments on it. And if you rent those out, you'll have just enough to pay the mortgage. And then you get that $30 million home all to yourself, and you're like, sweet.
Yeah, I'm swimming in the swimming pool.
Yeah, you're just golden. So you rent those houses out, and it works great for a while, and then the economy takes a dip, and then you cannot get anybody to pay you rent. And now you have that $5,000 mortgage every month, and you have no way of paying it.
Yep.
Month after month goes by, and now the bank's saying, hey, look, you owe us a whole bunch of money. And you're like, dude, I can't get anybody to rent the property. I have no income to cover the mortgage. And then they come in and they say, we're going to take your house. You're left with, well, I got some equity in it. I'll sell it.
Right.
And then you sell it.
Yep.
It's all fine, but you never really had the money to own it in the first place.
Yep.
You never had the ability to truly manage it well in the first place, not because you're not smart, not because you don't work hard, but because you just don't have those kind of financial means.
Totally.
Well, when you start talking about putting this land into state control, it's like giving you the house, where if it remains in federally managed hands, we have the entire United States funding these lands. We have every citizen in New York, LA, across the country contributing with tax dollars and so on to help pay that mortgage that we all collectively own.
Absolutely.
Well, that's a whole different ball game to the tune of, well, we could actually own these lands and manage them better. Are they being managed really well right now? No. I think everybody that's part of the pain of it all, right?
Totally.
It's like, we don't really like how they're collectively owned and how they're being managed.
I think there's a point to that, though.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, just like the economic financial side on the state side, that's the same thing on the federal side, because there's funding that could be issued, right?
Absolutely.
But isn't.
Yeah.
Which is critical into people's perception of how something's being managed. Think about, again, to your point, if you don't have any money to pay the landscapers, the place is going to get ugly pretty quick. And I think there's some parallels there where on the federal side and land, again, you can address this better than I could, but the funding isn't as it should be.
Well, I think, people get pretty fired up when a road gets closed down. Now, roads get closed down for all sorts of reasons, but a lot of times they're getting closed down because the maintenance money isn't there, right? And I think we just got a congressional fix, which we're all pretty excited about, where fires aren't going to be on regular budget anymore. They're going to take that off budget. That's not going to happen until 2020, I believe. But fire right now takes over the half of the budget of the Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service. So not only is that happening, but budget's been going down, that Congress appropriates for the last 2 decades, right? And so you're trying to do less with more. And so, you're starving this body, right? And what happens when you starve a body? It gets sick. Well, now we should divest these lands. Well, how about Congress just does its job and we appropriate enough money and so that we're managing lands in a better way. And so that road that person is pissed off doesn't get shut down anymore.
But what is the common response to that road getting shut down? It's like, we're pissed off at the federal government because they're screwing up our lands, right? They're mismanaging them.
They're cutting us out of our own public lands, right?
I think, to your point, there's a lack of understanding of what does that really mean. And Randy went through this a while ago where he kind of just peeled it all back to ultimately, to your point, Congress is dictating how things are going to get managed based on how much money's issued out. And that is a point that I don't think is as widely understood as maybe it needs to be, just so people can really wrap their arms around what does that mean when that road gets closed and why did it happen?
Totally. And, and sometimes that road got closed for habitat security, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, there's all sorts of reasons why that road maybe gets closed, right? But a lot of times it's because we're not given enough money from Congress to actually get things done.
There was a case in Oregon when I was with Oregon Hunters Association, and they were closing a bunch of roads, and it was actually being mandated from D.C., basically. And the cause of it is that there was a lot of unregulated OHV use, and it started in Montana, and they did studies on these new OHV roads and everything, and the spread of invasive weeds. And, guys were just running amok. Well, they were dragging the weeds from their farm or ranch or wherever they came from and spreading invasive weeds. And so they're like, we have to get control of this, because invasive weeds are an epidemic in many places. Like Eastern Oregon's a really good example. Yeah. And so it was this mandate across the board that every state had to address this. And in Oregon, in the Umpqua National Forest, they were addressing it, but they weren't taking it. They weren't actively doing their job to the point that they're like, okay, this is where the problem areas are. They were just like, we have to do something. And so we're just going to do something. Yeah. And, this is where people can really make a difference. Folks got involved. We sat in on this travel management plan for the Umpqua National Forest as an organization. There was volunteers there from the Jeep clubs, you know, from the OHV clubs, from Oregon Hunters Association. We sat in there, and they showed us the map where they're closing all these roads, and it was like 1,200 miles of road they were closing, and like 900 miles of OHV trail. And we're looking at the map, and this is places that we hunt, we fish and camp, like all of us. And we're looking at this map, and one road specific, I asked the Forest Service employee that was holding the meeting, I'm like, have you been on this road right here? They're like, well, no, but I'm sure one of our technicians has. I said, have you ever been in anywhere up that drainage? Like, no. That road that you're proposing to close is a paved through road. It's paved. There's nothing wrong with it. I was just on it 2 weeks ago. It's a perfectly fine road. It's a through road to another road system. Oh, so we threw a pretty big fit about it, about their proposals, and offered to fund road inventory, and offered up volunteers to go out and actually inventory those roads to their standards on their documents. And they turned us down, pushed forward with their plan anyway to close that, 1,200 miles of road. And we threw an absolute fit. We got our local senator involved. We got our congressman involved, and they ended up, I'm not sure what happened to the guy, but the forest manager ended up leaving, and they brought a new one in, and they started from scratch. End result, after a year and a half from the start to the final plan, they closed like 300 miles of road in total. And they were roads that volunteers inventoried, paid for with their own gas, went up there and inventoried these roads. And they're like, yeah, you can't even drive a Jeep down this road. So close it. So that's, an example of where people can make a difference.
And there's two things that you said in there, though, that I want to pick up on, is that maybe like precipitated some of this too. Was some illegal behavior, right? Was at the very beginning, right? Like people driving where they're not supposed to drive, creating more weeds, creating more, user created roads. And so there's a problem there. And I that's a small fraction, right? I'm guessing, it's like poachers. It's a small fraction, but it gives everybody a bad name. And then I think the second piece is that, like enforcement, like, we're talking about these dwindling budgets. Well, we have dwindling budgets for enforcement officers that are out there. And so the areas that they have to cover are so gigantic, and then when people get busted, especially for this illegal stuff, it's like a little teeny slap on the wrist. And so it's like a cost of doing business. Like I've talked to guys, that go around gates with an ATV and are bringing an elk out, and they're like, why are you doing that? And it's like, well, it's a fine. It's a $500 fine, and that's easier or whatever to
charge a packer to come in and
absolutely. And a lot of times, they go to like to the judge, and the judge throws it out because it's like, this is for you're making me deal with a $500 fine. He's like, so I think that's partly what's going on too.
Yeah, I've been reading like The Wilderness Warrior about.
Oh man, that's a big book.
Yeah,
it's a good one though.
Almost done.
Yeah,
I'm going to do a podcast on it here soon, and you read about Theodore Roosevelt, and when he starts putting these lands in place, and he starts promoting this conservation ethic across the United States, one of the things that he put a huge importance on and priority on was enforcement. Like, that's where you get like forest rangers and this sort of thing coming on for the first time. And there's no public lands. There's no wildlife. There's not a future for these things unless we make these rules and then enforce them. And that takes money. It takes time. I've heard some people write into me and talk about how, the tyrannical government owns these lands.
Sure.
And that's the narrative that they feel is accurate. Right. And they're like, well, I don't get a say. Like, they just do what they want. They just did this and they just did that. And the reality is, though, that this is not like the King of England, this situation here. It's not like he just makes the rules and you just have to deal with it. We have a government, call it a constitutional democracy, call it a republic, call it what you want. We elect officials to do what we want.
Right.
And when they don't do what we want, we don't reelect them. Right. We put different people in.
Right.
And it feels like a lot of our community, a lot of the public feels like that they don't actually have a say. But the reality is they do. They just have to decide that they want to put forth the effort.
I mean, look at Ty's example. That didn't sound easy.
No.
No.
It was a year and a half.
It was a lot of volunteer hours.
A lot of effort. I mean, that sounds daunting, but it worked, through their diligence and persistence, and eventually things happened, fall in the process.
Like right now, Mike Lee is pushing this agenda of state lands. He wants to basically, I feel like, rob American citizens of their right to public lands in Utah, take them, steal them, land grab them from the collective community of the United States, and then hoard them for the few, those that are in Utah, but more than likely also hoard them for those that are willing to pay for those lands or develop on those lands or whatnot. I don't like that.
That sounds elitist to me, right? It really does sound elitist to me.
It is elitist.
There's this thing that's open to all Americans. It doesn't matter who your parents are, how much money you made, where you come from.
Right.
That's open to all of us. That hike we did this morning, anybody in America can do that hike, And well, maybe not everybody in America.
It was pretty steep.
Pretty steep. But this idea of then selling it to the elite, the people that have the money or that want to exploit it, that is that's the elitism part, and that's the part they're turning on its head, which I think is crazy.
When I look at that, I go, okay, I don't want Senator Mike Lee anymore. He's not doing and he's not pushing the agenda and the things that I believe in as a citizen. I will not vote for him.
Right.
I will vote for someone who aligns with my values and the things that I cherish. And that's partly getting the step of getting involved and having a voice, is electing the right individuals to office. And I feel like that's just a cop-out when people say, I don't have a voice.
Right. Well, I think I like to say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, right? Which is true. You might not, again, get everything that you want.
Yeah.
But if you're not there, man, stop bitching and start a revolution is the way I look at it too, right? You have to be engaged. And again, you're not going to get everything you want. But if you're not trying, this country, that example of, Congressman Chaffetz that tried to sell 3.3 million acres and then pulled it, his support back for that in a week. That was because the people said, don't do that, right?
Yeah,
that wasn't because he woke up one morning and was like, nah, that wasn't a very good idea. And so the squeaky wheel at that point got the grease, right? And that grease was don't do this.
Mike's background is pretty interesting. I went down a bit of a rat hole after his speech through Wikipedia and such. And it's funny because he paints this whole elitist picture, and his background is pretty interesting. His father was the dean of a prominent law school here in the city of Utah, then later became the president of that university. Spent 2 different stints in both the Carter and the Reagan administration, doing some stuff, I believe, in the judicial branch of the government. And so Mr. Lee is literally grown up as a career politician. His law degree and background all is kind of stemmed from what his father did. So it's interesting how he paints the picture of public lands being this elitist when, I'm just looking at what I see, but his background seems far more like the parallel that he drew to that elitist community than what I see when I'm out hunting or fishing or hiking around.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting.
Yeah. When he said that, I was like, what are you talking about? What? I don't know what you're talking about, because I traverse thousands of acres of public land across the West, and I'm not blocked from it.
Right.
What do you mean it's just hoarded for some of the elite and we're robbing the American people of their inheritance? It's
how many helicopters do you see flying into that plateau where they get out and they got their champagne, it just does not happen,
I wouldn't turn down the ride. But
I think that Mr. Tom Healy in Montana, when this elitist kind of thing came out, he's like, man, I'm barely able to keep even like this, and public lands provide places for me to go get meat, to put on the table for the family. I'm building my own canoes, that come off of wood from, the public lands. I'm picking huckleberries, I'm picking morel mushrooms. Those public lands help him survive just, where we are right now. And you're calling me an elitist is what, again, I think that idea is one that we need to turn on its head.
Yeah, in the Wilderness Warrior, they talk about Theodore Roosevelt saying, and I've heard this quoted other places too, he believed strongly that these wilderness areas and going out into the wild are what brought peace to his soul. Like when his mother and wife died, like the same day,
which is crazy. He was like, all right, I'm out of here. He's like, his sister took
checking
care of
out.
his daughter
Yeah.
who was
He's
born
like-
that day. And he's like, I'm out.
wilderness. It's like
Yeah.
repeatedly when he hit a crisis in his life or when Roosevelt felt lost, it was the wilderness that grounded him and brought him back. And so
Has that happened in your life?
absolutely, it's 100% true for me.
Yeah.
And I believe it's true for anyone who has experienced it.
Yeah.
And I worry about how civilized society has really become the dominant mode of living.
Right.
So
The urban versus rural kind of.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that out of touch.
That's
thing
where I
where
think
people have never spent the night outside in the woods.
Yeah, that's where the recent, more so than in the past, where there's the group of the outdoor retailers, the outdoor recreationists, and the hunters and anglers kind of collectively coming together is a great thing. If we can inspire, encourage more people that have not been out in wild places to get out and try it, be it a campsite that has a nice little bathroom there, or you're out completely out in the wilderness, that's a plus.
Absolutely.
That's a win for everybody, because to your point, maybe somebody then has that moment where it resonates with them and they, kind of have an epiphany about their life.
Yeah.
Right. And I think for a lot of us, man, if I'm ever stressed out or not in a good headspace, all I need to do is go stand in a river for a couple hours with my fly rod, and suddenly life gets better.
Get angrier. Oh,
That's golf.
oh, golf.
But it's like that solace is what you're talking
Yeah,
about,
for
right?
sure.
Like those places that you kind of can reset, maybe is a better way to say it. I think, the title of this podcast, like with the gritty piece of that, right? Like that grit, like these public lands, you can find that grit, and I think
Strenuous life.
Yeah, and that strenuous life that Theodore Roosevelt talked about, right? And I think that, when those chips are against you, I think that's that American thing where we're like, we put our shoulders back, and I think that public lands, like there's many moments that I can relate to in that, but so can a mountain biker, so can a mountain climber, all these people that have been out in the woods and felt that kind of the weight of the world on their shoulders. And you have two choices. You can turn around, go home, or you can put your shoulders back. And I think that's that grit, that is American spirit. I think our public lands embody.
Brian, we have a mutual friend, Mark Livesey, and Mark recently took his staff. He owns Ultramax Sports, which is an event production company, and they put on like Tough Mudders and marathons and triathlons and that sort of thing. And he took his staff on a retreat into Yellowstone. And he took all his 12 llamas or whatever it is that he drug them all in, and he said, half of my staff have never even been camping before.
Yeah.
Like not even car camping. And he drug them like 6, 7 miles, 8 miles up this trail and took them fly fishing on a renowned stream in Yellowstone. And he said they had, and I talked to a couple of them, one of them talked to her specifically, and she said it was the most amazing experience in her life. She found an elk shed, they saw bison. It was hard work to get back there, even though head llamas pack all their stuff, which is awesome. But,
So says the Yama man in the making.
I'm his mentored child. Yeah. But like, when he told me that, I'm like, how could you have never gone camping before? How is that possible? And they're from Missouri. Mm-hmm. And so, there's not a ton of public lands in Missouri.
I've been studying Theodore Roosevelt a lot, reading various books, and what I want to figure out was how he launched this conservation ethic, and not just him, but all those that were with him at the time. How did he do it? How did he achieve it? How did he get there? Because, at the time we were raping the planet, and he completely reversed that and brought people to an awareness and then a passionate fervor for protecting and preserving lands and animals and bringing them back. And it's like, how did he do it? And the one thing I felt like he did was he got people to realize, to really internalize the importance of these wild places and wild animals. Like once he got them to go, you know what, I can't imagine a world without elk,
Right.
without deer, without these birds, without this. Once he got them there, and then they started to go, man, clean water matters, and wilderness matters, and forests matter, and the bear matters, and the cougar, and the bobcat. Once he got them thinking about things and really valuing those, it was like everything else sort of just, of course we're going to set aside these lands. Of course we're going to support this effort over here.
Yeah, I think that's true, but that was not like all of America either, right? Like
Yeah,
at the same time that he was doing that, like he was, you know, I mean, he was a genius, right? Like at the time when this rape and pillage, mostly it was timber harvest at that point going on, but there was, you know, senators from my home state of Montana and Wyoming and Idaho, and I'm guessing Utah, that fought him, you know, while they were doing that. And
Oh,
so,
the
like,
railroad,
absolutely.
yeah. And so he's not only convincing, what I felt like he's doing is he's winning the hearts and minds of the people,
Absolutely.
and then he's litigating and policy outmaneuvering the corporations and those big tycoons that were against him. But they labeled him socialist.
Yeah.
They labeled him a land grabber. They labeled him, a tree hugger, basically. I mean, they hit him hard all the time. They wrote lies about him. They tried to disparage, make him into a hypocrite or a joke or a laughing stock.
Right.
And Randy Newberg talked about this. He's like, dude, advocacy hurts.
Yeah.
Like getting involved is never comfortable.
Right.
It's never comfortable, but it is worth it. So you kind of just have to, if you think you're going to go out there and it's all going to be like sunshine and roses, you're probably going to quit when things get tough.
I would just say though, like we've talked a lot about taking action and getting involved, and how do you start that if you haven't ever done it before? Man, for me, it's just, if I just close my eyes and imagine some of my favorite places on earth, maybe where I grew up hunting in Oregon and Mount Emily Unit. My family started hunting there in 1969, or the Gila National Forest in New Mexico is a really special place to me. If I just think about no longer being able to go there, I mean, that's all I need to know that I need to do something more.
Yeah.
And I think if more people put it in maybe those perspectives and thought about what would it be like if your favorite place that you love to go hunt or fish is now not accessible.
Or bike or hike or climb.
Yeah,
paddle.
Exactly. Yeah, obviously your crowd's a little more into the hunting, fishing probably, but you're right. Any of those things, those favorite places of yours that are on public lands, what if you couldn't go there anymore? Mm-hmm. Would you be interested in taking some action at that point in time to try to get it back? And if the answer is yes, then, probably no better time to step forward and do something right now.
Well, I get that all the time, Land. People want to know how can they make a difference? How can they be involved? How can they change the world? What? Probably no better person to ask than you right here. Like, what can people do?
Well, I think the first thing is having leaders like yourself that talk about like the history on how we got this stuff. None of this happened by accident. And I think that's something that you really need to, understand fundamentally, right? The reason the United States is different is because we wanted it to be different. And leaders like Theodore Roosevelt helped us set, he's the father of conservation really in this country. And without him, we're in a much different country. But I think knowing that history, and it didn't happen by accident, and it's not going to be carried forward by accident, is something we need to understand. Then I think, Brian's point, you're thinking about your place, what happens? What happens if that goes away? What happens, maybe I still have access to it, but it's been totally defiled. And it's like, I never even want to go there again because it breaks my heart, right? And so I think that's where it starts. But, there's individual actions that can be taken all the time. And I think, becoming a member of a conservation organization, and, I'm super selfish on backcountry hunters and anglers because, that's my job, but it's also my passion, for public lands. But, there's other organizations like the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, Trout Unlimited, that are engaged in kind of this public lands fight. So I think if that's the very least thing that you do, it's $25 to belong to backcountry hunters and anglers. That's less than, dinner with your wife or girlfriend or whatever, like out at night. And so that's one thing you can do. I think, getting educated on the issues, like the current issues of what's going on. And so, we're living in the, the information age, right? Now you gotta sometimes be suspect of where that information is coming from, but do your due diligence and know what's going on. And then, it sounds, simple, but it also seems like, I think this is where people think their voices don't count, is pick up the phone and call your elected official. It sounds like this barrier, but it's very easy to do. What you're probably going to do is you're going to get a staffer and you're going to say, hey, my name's Tawney. I want to make sure the Land and Water Conservation Fund does not sunset September 30th. They're like, okay, boom. What they're doing? They're taking little check marks and they're seeing how many calls they get and they're going to report that to their elected official. So making a phone call, sending an email is absolutely essential. The other thing I think that we've been talking about today is that there's all these public meetings, right? And I think whether that's about, how we're going to manage that travel on that national forest. It's whether, politicians are seeking feedback. Going to those places, and even if you don't speak up, if you're wearing, public landowner shirt, or if you're wearing some hunting clothes, just letting them know that there's people in the room. But if you can grab that microphone and tell them a story on why these things matter to you, I think, we were talking earlier about how powerful stories are, and that's what people are going to remember. Get up on the mic. You don't have to be the most articulate person in the world. You don't have to know the issue, but this is my place. This is what's happened on this place. This is what this means to me. This is what it means to my family. That starts to move the needle a little bit. And so I think those things, and I think the last is that, we're building this, I would say this army across the country. And when I say we, I think this is a sportsman collective. I think we've been complacent a little bit, right? And I think sometimes people ask what's the biggest threat. And I think it's our complacency, because we think it's just always going to be there. And that's not the case. And so I think educating your friends, it's it's that old game of numbers, right? The more people you have, the louder your voice is going to be. And so the more that, you're talking to your hunting buddy and saying, hey, this is an issue that's going on. Maybe you should think about, doing this, that one-on-one conversations. We live in a world of digital memes and all sorts of stuff, but these conversations we're having right now, that's the way you sway people, and that's the way you actually get them involved and fired up. So those are, I think, a few, would be, really, belong to an organization, write an email or make a phone call, show up at a meeting, and then really pass it on to the next person.
That's what I think is powerful, really powerful today, is each individual person that, let's say, listens to this podcast or listens to Shooting the Bull or follows Hush or follows their buddy who follows BHA or who follows Meat Eater or, right? Each of us have our own sphere of influence. And then when we pick up knowledge or we learn something or we feel passionate about a subject, man, we can take that, and within our group of people, there's only a few people that are going to convince my mother of anything. That's just how it is. And I'm one of those few people, right? That's the power that each of us have, and each individual has certain people that they connect with, that they're close with, and those people value an opinion from a certain source. And so you can be that source. Yep. And it might seem small. You're like, well, I only impacted 10 people, with this message about public lands. But then how do you know where that ripple effect stops, right? It might be that the 10 people you have impacted, that person impacts someone else who then impacts 10,000 people.
Right.
It's you don't know. I think we all have a voice. And I think that what you're saying there, taking accountability and responsibility for this thing we have, this treasure we have, and actually being vocal about it, I think that's huge.
You have to.
I was going to say, we're in a unique time right now, too. Jason Chavitz's situation last year that you referenced earlier, where he pulled back his initial bill pretty quickly, I think largely was from social media.
Absolutely.
That spun so fast and so strong across so many different platforms that there was no avoiding it for him. He was getting just crushed.
There was no complacency during that.
Well, I think, what would happen there, though, there had been some education. I think there had been some complacency, and there was some education, and so people were waiting, for something to happen, and he had introduced that bill before and hadn't had the pushback that he got. Well, he was in a different era at that point when he did that, and people were like, oh, you're trying to do that? And it was just that passion kind of came out, and it was a place for them to get engaged.
Well, I think another big part of what you're saying, Brian, is there's a lot of, big importance and dispensing accurate and factual information.
Absolutely.
There's a deal of responsibility on all of us to be telling the truth and, using facts and numbers that are scientifically proven or proven by a study, because if we're dispensing inaccurate information, we're part of the problem. And I find that happens often, especially through social media.
Yeah. One thing this is just one of my pet peeves. I'll throw it out there. But I feel like in the hunting space, complacency is a big deal because let's face it, we're a group of people who like to go outside and disconnect from the world. And then when we're in the world, we're like, we just want to go back to where we're not connected.
As soon as you said that, I was thinking about last time I was out. You're going to go back.
And so you have that personality already, or that solace you get from the wilderness. And so, man, it's like, I don't want to get involved in all this crap. I just want to go do me and disappear. And the problem is it won't last if we do that. So my pet peeve is this. I find that there are a lot of people in the hunting space, when they do get involved and they start trying to present their stance on public lands. A lot of times what they go for, and this is in the case of hunting as well. Yeah. They approach it from a scientific perspective and a factual perspective. So many do. And I love that. Like, I love it. We have science on our side. We have, when it comes to hunting and the ethics of it, we have, and when it comes to public lands, we have a lot of evidence that points to keeping it public and evidence to how federally managed is much better than state and so on. But, I wish more of us would actually not be too afraid to go into the moral debate on this stuff, because I love scientific debate and scientific discussion and argument, but I feel like we kind of bail out of the moral argument, and I wish we'd get a little more ballsy in that area and a little more educated in that space, because people don't sit there and say, well, they don't care that I killed an elk. They care about why I killed an elk.
Right.
They don't care about public lands. They care about why public lands. They care about why animals matter. They don't care about that animals are there. You know what I mean? Like the moral part.
I'm really glad you brought it up, because I think, Ty is right. Like, our information has to be correct. Like, that's just, there's a high level of scrutiny. And then you also want people to trust you. So, like, on the numbers. But I think when you talked earlier, about Theodore Roosevelt, I thought that was really interesting. That's what you brought up, is that, like, he kind of convinced people, like, that these things matter, that these are part of what makes us all whole, right? And so I think
an American,
right? There's moral obligation then to carry that forward, and not just utilize it right now and they'll take care of it somehow when they go forward. I think that argument. And again, that happens with stories, and that's like a deeper thing than just numbers. And I think we win kind of the numbers game, if we really want to play it all the time. But people glaze over with that stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think when you talk about passion and kind of, why, the why of what you're doing, I think that's really the way you can start to influence more people. That's good.
Can I share a pet peeve?
Yeah.
I mean,
yes.
we're
all going to get pet peeves.
Is it a pet?
Similar but different is, I feel like when these topics come up on public lands, it immediately goes to what political party you belong to.
Oh, yeah.
This is a Democratic. These Democrats they're just trying to, like, save all the trees and this, versus, these Republicans. I just get so tired of putting it into those buckets, because I don't think public lands fit into those buckets personally. And so, that to me is something that I wish the tides would change within our community of hunters and anglers, to stop thinking about, like, the R's and the D's, or who, it's beyond that, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
And so I think a lot of people, like you were talking about earlier, Land, is maybe have a perception that certain organizations fall a certain way and what have you. And, I think,
but there's some people I know, like, to ask them to vote for the Democrat that's pro public land and so forth, over the Republican who's trying to use literally land grabbing, getting them to vote Democrat I found that to be a big challenge, and it's frustrating.
Yeah,
because to me, I'm like Newberg says it all the time. I'm the party
of hunting and fishing, right?
Yeah, I'm the party of hunting and fishing.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
And I think that's the way I vote, is I vote, I'm a one party issue or one, issue voter, and it's on conservation. Like that's makes it easier for me. And I think, Brian, to your point, yes, there are certain politicians right now, and you can break that down into parties, are being more helpful than not, right? But the only way you change that is by like going and talking to those, to both sides of the aisle, right?
Yeah.
And I think that if people did more of that rather than get caught in these dogmatic things, that our country would start to move more to a compromise that's in the middle than these things that are on the farther. If you look at it as like an arc, right? Mm-hmm. And when it swings way over to the right, it gets pretty crazy. When it swings over to the left, it's pretty crazy. Yeah. Where stuff really happens is in this middle and the compromise, and that word compromise has become a dirty word, which, if when we went out to lunch today, if it had been like, no, that's exactly what you're having, you can't have anything but this. And it's like, no, we're going to have like a compromise. Everybody's going to get a little piece, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I was going to ask you about that a little bit because
the food at lunch, or
no, that was really good, but the compromise.
I almost learned how to use chopsticks.
No, you didn't. Land, often as I engage with BHA and I talk about the issues of the day, I get people that are disappointed in me for associating with all you gingers.
Yeah. That's like, oh, you're with the gingers. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. No, they seriously, they're concerned about my involvement with BHA because BHA in their mind kind of stands for these more liberal, or you've compromised because you've worked with Patagonia, or because you've done this or you've done that. And so you're sellouts and you're not really hunting and fishing. You're this or you're that. And so what's your response to that?
I mean, my first response to that is like, look at our body of work and what we're doing, and tell me that there's something that we're doing that is, anti-hunting and fishing. I mean, I think that there can be some disagreements on the fringe of kind of like maybe some of the actions that we take or the policies that we promote, but it's all in the name of hunting and fishing. That's the way I would first, answer that thing. And then I would say, come to one of our events, whether that's the pint night that we're going to have tonight, here in Salt Lake, or like our rendezvous. Our rendezvous that we had in Boise this last year had 1,300 people there. And, it's hard to not meet somebody, that you want to talk to more about like their place and how they do things. I mean, you have the kind of the hardcore there, like people that came out the womb, like flint mapping their own like arrowheads. I mean, literally like that's like the level. And you also have people that are kind of new hunters and new anglers in that same space. But this is a welcoming space for them to all have that conversation, right? And I think that take a look at, the body of work, and then come to an event and take a look at the people that we're attracting. And I don't think you can walk away from either one of those things being like, those BHA guys. I mean, the same things that you hear, right? Because I think it's easy to pigeonhole and then not do
stereotype
any kind of, and not do any kind of research, right? Like,
group identity, just stick them in the liberal bucket of this sort of Patagonia image, anti-hunting,
I'd like to speak to the Patagonia piece.
Well, now, are you going to pronounce his name right this time? Or are you gonna
I wasn't even going to go there.
Can you try to?
No.
Yeah, because he can't.
It's Yvon Chouinard. So I got to introduce Yvon Chouinard at the rendezvous. And he was a storyteller. And
who is he, by the way?
He is the founder of Patagonia, and he's a freaking awesome dude. But I'm the opposite of the Cool Kid Club. We were talking about the Cool Kid Club earlier today.
Yeah.
When I was in high school, everybody's wearing Nikes. I wore Adidas. When I was in high school,
which are still pretty cool, by the way.
Right, but everybody else was wearing Nikes. Like, I'm literally got in fist fights over Nikes. Swear to God. Kids were taunting me. I was the poor white kid with, no shoes, living in the ghetto, and my neighbor kids would come taunt me with their Nikes, and I'd thump them. And so,
Still bitter about the Nike.
I've never been one.
Not about the Nike life.
I've never forgot about that. So,
okay, wait, I know his Christmas presents.
My daughter consequently can't get Nikes either. Not that they're a bad product, but so it's just like that Cool Kid Club thing, and so when I moved from podunk redneck lumbertown Roseburg, Oregon, and landed in Missoula, Montana, literally everybody was wearing Patagonia.
Yep.
And I was like,
it's one of the things that
I'm just not going to buy Patagonia just because of that.
I find annoying about Montana.
Right? So it has nothing to do with the company, nothing to do with the product. It's just my own personal, I I don't know if I don't want to stand out, but I don't want to be part of everything everybody else is doing.
Right.
And so when Patagonia was invited to our rendezvous and Yvonne was going to be a guest speaker, in the back of my mind, you know, I'm playing all this, right? And but I also realize that if we don't sit down at the table, we're talking about the table again, with folks that have a different opinion than us, but have a bigger play in the game, like Patagonia and the Patagonia crowd and the REI crowd, if we don't sit down with them, educate them on what we do and why we exist and why we want that little piece of our public land pie, we're losing from the get-go. Like, we are going to lose. It doesn't matter. We don't have to agree with everything that they do, and they don't have to agree with everything that we do. But the common denominator is that public lands and the fact that we want to keep them public and we want to maintain access. So that's the compromise piece, is let's sit down at the table. Let's figure out what we agree on and figure out what we don't agree on. What we don't agree on, let's just leave that out of the room. Let's work for the common good. What I really loved was Yvonne told some amazing, and he's an older gentleman. I don't know how old he is, but he's definitely retired, fly fisherman. Yeah. He's a hunter. And he told some really cool pictures or stories about killing stuff. Like, it was
cringeworthy.
Oh, totally. I was in the back going, oh my God, he's telling that. That's like roadkill type scenarios, you know, and like taking roadkill home. I'm like, that was my first deer, you know, totally related to the guy. So, you know, everybody wants to judge a book by its cover and talk about things they don't really know about until you actually sit down across the table and talk to the person. And so that is that Patagonia piece, you know, that everybody's so, oh, see, you guys are in bed with Patagonia. No, we're willing to sit down at the table and talk with an organization. You know, this is a company, but they definitely have an organization too, and they have a huge pull, far bigger than ours. Yeah. And if we can't unite that, then we're in trouble.
Right.
Did you get yourself a jacket?
Do you have a Patagonia hat?
There was vests. There was vests involved.
I mean, that's like concentric circles what you're talking about, right? Like if you have somebody that's in a circle over here and over here and then over here, where they meet is all in the middle, you know, and that's the place, that's that sweet spot, and that's those public lands and public waters, you know. And are we going to disagree a little bit about the management of that? Probably. But first of all, we got to make sure they're there and they're not, you know, being totally exploited, right? And then we can talk about stuff after that.
Right. And to me, by shutting the door on an organization or an individual because you can't agree, to me, it closes down all potential for education, growth, and knowledge down the road. So you're not going to convince an organization like Patagonia to stand behind maybe hunting or a conservation, hunting approach for conservation. If you just say, we close the door on you, you're not invited.
Totally.
Even though we agree on this issue, boom, it's over. That doesn't present an opportunity for growth in the future. And maybe we have a lot to learn from them. By agreeing that, hey, we're all on the side of public lands and we're going to fight for these together, and then we're going to agree to disagree on these issues, there's a potential down the road that we see each other's value in a different light.
Yep. How many people sitting at that rendezvous probably were like shocked about his stories of hunting and killing stuff? Like, you got to be kidding me! I had no idea. Right? I always thought Patagonia was anti-hunting, but they actually ran like a TV commercial when the whole
monument stuff.
Yeah, the monument stuff was going on, and they flat out included hunters in the commercial that he was a part of, and I think that's surprising. That opens a lot of people's eyes. Like, man, I had no idea that he was into hunting.
That's the only commercial they've ever done. Like,
right.
Let that play around in your brain
for sure.
For a
and
bit,
the fact that they included hunters.
They included hunters, and it was in, you know, and they used it around monuments, you know, and it wasn't about Patagonia. It was paid for by Patagonia, but it's the first thing they've ever done. Yeah. And they included hunters. And I think, you know, there's this stat, and might not get this one totally right, but it's like, I think 80% of people in America still approve of hunting, right? Well, our numbers are dwindling. Yeah. And, you know, and like you talked about, you know, urbanization versus rural kind of divide that's happening. Like if we don't put our best foot forward and try to have conversations, you know, that are, they're robust, and actually talk more about just the pulling the trigger piece or letting that arrow fly, like we're going to lose, man. And we really have to be the ones that bridge that divide. And I think, besides public lands, I think the best way to do that is through food.
Yeah.
Food, literally. I mean, I think the more and more that I'm watching like millennials get into hunting just because they want to, kill their own meat. But food, and it's cooked delicious. When it's cooked delicious, I don't care if you hunt or fish or don't. Like, that's good stuff, right?
Right.
Everybody recognizes good food. So.
That's right.
Yeah. And Randy has another quote that I really like, Randy Newberg, where he's like, if I only agreed to work with people who agreed with me 100%, I would be a party of one. That would be my party.
Right.
At some point you have to agree to disagree. And that's something I always say when I'm responding to a comment or something publicly and whatnot. I might dress down somebody because I totally disagree with them. And I flat out just say, your position I find horribly misguided, and here's what I think, and this is my feelings. But hey, at the same time,
you might work on that approach, Brian.
I can't help it, man. I'm like pretty direct. So I think
it's actually good to be direct.
I'm like, I will agree to disagree. And just so you know, disagreement does not mean disrespect. They're not the same thing. So I can completely disagree with you. It doesn't mean that I, as a human being, I think you're I think less of you. It's like we all come to things differently in life and how we see things. And so I think it's the more you can take that mindset. My mom would always tell me that. She's like, disagreement does not mean disrespect, and we can agree to disagree. Like, we're not going to agree on this issue, but we can agree to disagree on that, and then we can move forward with these other things.
It's like a shared understanding, right? And I think, last week we were over in Billings and we were meeting. There was a United Property Owners of Montana were having a meeting, and after their meeting, we invited them to come over to a pint night that we were having, and 3 of them came, and 2 of them wanted to have a conversation, and 1 of them didn't. And I think the one that did want to have a conversation lost an opportunity that night. Now, the one gentleman that I spoke to, did we agree on everything? Absolutely not. But we found some things. I mean, there was a place in the Bob Marshall Wilderness where we'd both been and geeked out on how awesome it was for a little bit, and then started talking about other issues. Now, do I have more of a shared understanding where he's coming from? Yes. Can I see his point of view? Yes. And so as we start to have these conversations about how, lands are managed, I have a better idea on where he's coming from. And I would not have had that if I would have said, nope, you think this way, I think this way, and we're not going to have a conversation. Then, that idea of compromise there's no opportunity to even have that, right?
No,
I think conversations need to be happening.
Complacency. We talked about that. You mentioned it a few times. We kind of covered it a little bit, but I wanted to go over it one more time because you and I both agree, complacency is, I think, the biggest threat to not only public lands, but I think by extension, if you make everything private, because I've had some people go, what's the big deal? It's an American tradition. It's American value to own private property and improve it. So what's the big deal if it becomes like Texas? The whole United States is now privately owned. That's what this country was all about. What is your response to that?
I mean, that's the end of America. That's my response to that. I mean, I think, these places, I'll step back. First thing I would say is that I respect private property rights. There's a lot of places that I have access to that are through private property to public land that I hunt. I've hunted on a lot of private land. I shot a deer last year in block management, which is our public access to private land program in Montana. I shot my elk. I walked through that same ranch and then hunted, elk on the public ground that was behind it. So I think they're an integral part, and we should respect those property rights. But this idea that we're going to privatize things goes back to, Senator Lee, and this idea of kind of the King's Forest. If you are going to hunt in Texas, it's 98% private and 2% public. You have to pay a lease or you have to know somebody.
Yeah.
That's the way you're going to hunt. That's the only way you're going to hunt. And so for the average person, that's unattainable, and they really can't pay that. And that's the norm in a lot of states all across this country. And I think, if we want, and, I go back to America, is that, everybody's got a chance, right? Like if you are willing to put in the work, you got a chance. Well, that's what public lands embodies. And so I think, if we sell this public land to the highest bidder, and privatize it, I think America that's a fabric that is woven through American history that I think is like unique, right? That goes away, and I think so goes America.
What do you think happens to animals?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that, hunting will persist. It's not like hunting and fishing would go away. It'd just be a lot different. I think that, animals don't care if they're on private land or public land. I think high fence is a different conversation that restricts movement, but, they don't know property boundaries. I think that, if hunting numbers go down, then what kind of management are we having? And then also, if people can't participate, then they care less about it, right? And that's one of the great things about public lands, that you get to get out there and get your fingers dirty,
right?
And put your foot in the stream, right? You dip your toe in there, and then you're like, oh, you have more of appreciation of it. And so then, if I can't hunt ducks on public land anymore, am I going to be a member of Ducks Unlimited? Probably not, right? I see the value in ducks and being out there,
right? But
I think there's less of an appreciation maybe for those animals if there's not access to them, and even if you can't go. If you can't go observe them, right? Like the bird watchers that are doing all the bird watching. I mean, I'm a bird nerd when I'm out in the woods, I mean, I really, that enhances my experience. But if I can't get out there, why should I care about birds, in general? So I think what happens to wildlife in some ways, they're probably going to be okay. They'd be managed pretty strictly, on private land, but it'd be, I think the wilds would be gone. And I think that if going back to the morality of this, is there something special about seeing an animal in the woods, that is free, and isn't, managed to where, okay, you can't shoot that buck this year, because we're waiting, and we're going to give it this many minerals, whatever. There's something special about that wild animal that, that's the way it's always been.
I think that there are certain animals that win the lottery when there's private land and civilization encroaches. Then there's animals that absolutely lose the lottery. They're the losers.
Yeah.
You look at out east, there's certain animals you cannot put back.
Yeah, ever.
You can't put grizzly bears back.
Yep.
You're probably not going to get wolves back. You're not going to get elk back.
In a real way.
No.
Yeah.
Not in anything like it used to be.
Bison.
Bison. Yeah, they can't even get in the West.
Right.
Yeah.
So to me, it's like there's certain animals, and we're talking about the big ones, megafauna here. But what about all the little ones that just cannot tolerate civilization? They die.
Yeah.
I feel like if you make it like Texas or Missouri or some of these other Pennsylvania,
Kansas,
I think once you do that, and you make it all private, there are going to be animals that maybe not now, maybe it'll be 100 years from now, 200 years, but eventually you're going to displace the animals. You're going to lose the animals that need vast tracts of public land untouched.
Yep.
You can't have those you can't have those species. So I was doing some
really
math the other day, and I was like, well, how much land is the United States? And it's been a while since I looked that number up, but I think it's off the top of my head. I think it's 32 billion acres or something like that. Out of that, how much is public land? 640 million acres, which represents something like, I think 25%, 26% of the land mass. So something like 25% of this 32 billion is now federally managed, collectively owned land by all U.S. citizens.
That math's not right, by the way, because 640 into 32 billion, I don't think totally works. I think it's like 3.2 billion. Is that right?
Okay. I'm not good at math.
I don't know. I just want to make sure anybody listens to it.
We've got our phones. We could look it up.
I said it on an earlier podcast, but I had the numbers
Go
correct.
back too. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I'm getting your point, though.
But yeah, I did the math. The percentage is right.
The percentage is right in the public, the 25%.
25 roughly, let's say, is this piece, right? So how much are we going to reserve for just wild places and wild animals? Like, how much do humans get to have? Is 75% of the land not enough? When Senator Mike Lee says he wants all of the rest of Utah, I'm like, I just feel like it's morally wrong to try to privatize that over, and you can say what you want about how you're not privatizing it, but in essence, that's what happens.
Absolutely.
And the math, you follow to the conclusion. That's where it leads you. And I look at that and I feel like, yeah, it's morally wrong. Like 20%, we can't save 2 acres out of every 10 for clean air and water.
Right. Just start there.
Wild
Just
animals.
start there, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
Just clean air and water. We can't do that.
You sound like a greenie, Brian.
Look,
Greedy
look,
greenie.
I'm all about my private property and my stuff. Like, get off. But we already took 75% of that. I feel like we should manage and reallocate and use that and draw the line in the sand and say the rest, that stays in public hands.
Well, I mean, we're not making any more of it, right? Like, this is not like, every once in a while, there's I've mentioned earlier, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is number one access tool in this country. Fishing access sites, access to public land. Once in a while, you'll work with a private landowner who, wants to see their place stay in exactly the same way it is now. And either wants an easement on there, so it's going to be like that forever, or they want to, sell that back to the American people, right?
Yeah.
God, I did that again. See that? And
Sell it too,
right? And I think sell it to the American people, and we get some of that back. Like, we just got a piece that's just east of Missoula. It's about 20 minutes east of Missoula. It was 5,000 acres that opened up, another 30,000 acres, right?
Right.
Because of the checkerboard kind of ownership. And so that happens once in a while, but the majority of the time, once we privatize this stuff, we don't get it back.
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, you're talking about these animals. One of the things that, Mr. Lee proposed was reinstating the Homestead Act. Now, the Homestead Act sounds really awesome when you have 3 million people in America and you're trying to get people to come out to the West. The Homestead Act sounds absolutely horrible when you have 330 million people. And like, I have my places that I would want, but how many other people are going to do that? And
do we get to race? Do we get to run?
It totally would be. And like, we'd be staking things, people be getting shot.
People.
I mean, like, this would be out of control. But like, the fragmentation of habitat that would happen within that, these animals that need big open spaces.
Mule deer that need undisturbed land to migrate from. Some of them go 3 states distance or 4 states. That's part of mule deer migration. It's part of their survival.
Absolutely.
To put highways, roads is already a huge like barrier to their survival. And now you're going to add like subdivisions and homes and schools and all this stuff in between. It's like, where are they going to go?
Yeah.
How are they going to survive?
Like, you talked about different species, right? Like the whitetails. Whitetails are crushing it, right?
Exactly.
Like in my town, I got, deer that have been living in town their entire time. Triplets is a norm, on whitetails. Yep. And so they're fertility rate is through the roof, right?
Coyotes. I think people see these wild animals living in the city.
They're going to be just fine.
And they go, yeah, dude, we're going to be fine.
It's not a big deal. It doesn't affect them.
Yeah. We can populate everything and the animals will just live around us and amongst us. It's like, no, there are certain species that doesn't work. I come from Evergreen before I moved here just a couple months ago. In Evergreen, Colorado, we have a few hundred elk that wander through the city all day long through the homes, people's backyards, right? We're able to cohabitate with these elk. But the black bears that come into town and steal your garbage, they get shot.
Yeah. Mountain lions, same thing.
Mountain lions, same thing. Like when they start coming into people's houses, it's like, get them gone.
Yep.
And then you have this surplus population of elk and they don't get hunted that much. And now you're just like killing, like it gets weird, man.
Oh, yeah.
It gets weird.
Messy.
And let's like do like contraceptive on them. You've heard those things. And I'm like, how much do we want to manipulate this system?
Nature is, you're playing with fire.
Totally.
So I see this whole thing and I think, there's animals that win the lottery and those that don't.
Fair.
And we need to be cognizant of the ones that don't. And I think that, having 2.5 acres set aside per every 10 for those animals is what makes America great. What makes it what it is. And I want people to care about that. And I want them to care about the water and the clean air and realize how precious that is and how amazing this country is for those reasons, and then get involved. Yeah. I like what you were saying. I want people to go, if you're not a member of BHA, do it, get involved there, start there. And in each state you have chapters.
Yep.
Right?
38 states now.
38 states.
We're working on some new ones, Brian.
Sweet.
We've got Iowa, Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, Kansas, Oklahoma, and then a couple others.
Yeah.
Excellent,
Yeah.
dude.
We'll
the
be
Yukon.
We'll be
the Yukon.
at
I'm gonna have
2020.
to.
By 2020, we'll have all 50 states covered,
Yeah.
and then hopefully all 13 Canadian provinces and territories.
I'll probably have to spend some extra time in the Yukon and make sure that there's.
I was surprised they came back. Like, I was surprised you came back.
So tell me this: what are some states right now that you would like a chapter in that isn't working on it? Any locations?
Well, obviously all of them, right? The unique place that we're at is like I'm working on this, for all intents and purposes.
Are you the bottleneck?
Solo. Yeah, I'm the bottleneck. Very well put.
I mean, look at him. He's a bottleneck right now.
Very well put. So yeah, so I have to pace myself, right? But up to this point, it's been the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So the more members that come at me and say, "Hey, we want a chapter," that's what we go off of. And obviously, there's some strategic planning with, for policy or
right.
Elections.
I think Ohio was a big addition for us this last year. And I think Ohio, what's amazing is these places that don't have as much public lands that we're used to. One, maybe not a place they ever go, but when they're sitting in that tree stand, I guarantee you they're dreaming about hunting elk in Montana or Utah. They're
100%.
not, and so I think there's that aspirational thing that public lands provide, even if you're never going to go there. And then if they do go there, it's like, kind of blows their mind. They want to protect it even more.
Oh, it's
and
unreal.
then what they have left, they want to protect as well. And so, Ohio is really important politically, just it's played a role in the last few presidential elections.
Yeah.
And I think that, having more of a voice there, is important. And again, we're trying to amplify that voice, right? Like, it's one thing to, we're almost at 25,000 members now. And so like, we're starting to be able to have a little bit more weight around what we do. But our power comes from when our people voice their opinion. Our power isn't like, hey, look over there. We got 25 people. Now let me tell you what I want to say.
Right.
Our power comes from, them
individuals,
them speaking up and then us amplifying that voice. Right. And I think, so in a place like Ohio, we've punched way above our weight for a long time. When we were 1,000 people, then 2,000 people, then 4,000 people, the ability to use traditional media and social media, you can make your voice louder. Right. So in a place like Ohio, where we're just starting out, we are starting to be able to do that. Now, when they start to have more numbers and more people speak up, their influence is going to grow, and I think that, I think back to, this election cycle that we're in, trying to get people to think about voting public lands and public waters, I think is a really good first step. These issues are starting to really elevate to top tier issues.
Yeah.
And I think when people start to vote that way and at least ask their politicians about that, politicians are pretty malleable, like they go where the wind is sometimes, and that's what they're supposed to do. And people sometimes say, oh, that person flip-flopped because they changed their stance on something. I'm like, no, they got more education and they listen to the people, and sometimes maybe I won't like that decision that they make, but they should be listening to the people and their views. I think, if I thought the same way I did when I was 18 right now, man, that'd be a bad place to be, and I've learned a lot, in the last, God, that's 27 years now, but 25 years. I think, that opportunity, to really, talk to people and help influence, and that happens, one person at a time.
Can you share with us a couple of chapters that have done some pretty awesome things, like within this organization?
Yeah,
like a couple that stand out for you.
Colorado really stands out. Colorado has a program talking about boots on the ground. It's the Habitat Watch program. And so they have volunteers in each of like the national forests of the BLM, and they have a panel of people, and for each one of those national forests or BLM regions, districts, they have volunteers that sit on these committees, and these committees represent their region, like their national forest, where they live, what they know. They represent them, and they bring them back to leadership, and they're involved across the entire state through all of these. I was looking at the leadership list for Colorado the other day, and it's like 30 some people in Colorado, volunteers that are involved in this, and they're crushing it. doing a great job. I mean, all of our chapters are doing awesome work. North Dakota, brand new chapter from last year. Before they were even a chapter, they were working on a illegal OHV signage project on the Badlands, and basically there was, many illegal roads punched in the Badlands. It's pretty flat country. They just go wherever they want. And so before they were even officially a chapter, they got with the regional manager there for the Forest Service and figured out which ones were legal and which ones were not. And then they went out on one leg before they became a chapter and did put some signs up, says, hey, this is an illegal road, don't travel on it. And then after they became a chapter, they finished that project, got some great media in the state-based news. And so it's things like that that they're working on. That
I'd give you probably two. And so I'd start with Minnesota. Mm-hmm. So Minnesota has been a chapter that's growing. Part of the reason it's growing is there's a huge threat to the boundary waters in the very northern part of Minnesota. There's a mine that's like about a quarter mile there that is proposed. And they're not against mining, just not in that spot, right? And all that water flows north there. So there's never been a copper sulfide mine that hasn't leached anything. And so it's going to happen. And then it's going to go into the boundary waters, which is the most visited, wilderness since it was established in 1964. Like every single year, that's the one that gets visited most in the entire America system. So they've been building kind of an organization around there and trying to create awareness and push back. I think that they're doing a really good job of doing that. But then also at the same time, in the state legislature, there was going to be a no net gain of public lands. And so, if there was an opportunity that I was talking about before where there's a farmer that says, hey, I want this place to stay the same. I want my kids to be able to come back. I want to give this to the fishing game, and let them manage it. And then I can come back and kids can come back. They couldn't do that. They'd have to sell something before, if that legislation was passed.
Really?
Right. And so
that just sounds evil.
Well, it's like, and here's my question about private property rights. When does that stop? If I, as a private landowner, want to,
make your land public.
Exactly. Shouldn't I be able to do that?
Hell
why does
yeah.
somebody tell me that I can't do that? Like, I just, private property, it works when it works for your interest, but not when it doesn't. That's a confusing thing. But what they did is that, they had a rally at the state capitol. And the state capitol, there's organizations there that participated like Pheasants Forever, and there's a Minnesota Deer Hunters, brought these people together, and they were able to, kind of speak in one voice, I would say, as sportsmen and women. And then that legislation got killed. And so that's an example. And then another thing that they're doing, this just breaks it down in one chapter, but it's like this, mentor program. They're working with the, state fish and game, agency for adult onset hunters, which I think is the worst terminology in the world.
I use it all the time.
It should be like new hunters, but it sounds like a disease, right?
I think that.
Oh man, you hear that guy got adult onset hunting? Oh yeah, he's got it bad. And that way it's good probably though, right? But
I like his
Brian just got over that.
I've been using that term for like 5 years.
But like new hunters, and creating mentors for them that aren't just like a one-time shot, right?
Yeah.
Like people that's actually going to follow them through a hunting season and not just one season, a couple. So they're doing that. And I brought up Wyoming, and I would say the same thing in Wyoming. So Wyoming, there's a land exchange that's going to happen. It's called the Bonander Land Exchange. It was a small parcel. I think it was like 5,000 acres.
So these were state
parcels,
lands.
Parcels that somebody, a very wealthy individual, wanted to, swap that out for another piece that wasn't as strategic either for wildlife habitat or for access. And so the state land board is like 5 people. Their initial reaction to that was like, yeah, this makes sense. And then our folks got involved. We're like, no, this doesn't make sense because now we're going to lose access to, I think it was another 15,000 acres,
Yeah,
right?
it's 10 or 15, yeah.
And so
Of federal land.
it was state land that was giving access to federal land.
Right.
And so they lose this piece, they lose that access.
Yeah.
And that's partly what's happening here is that you're almost privatizing that federally managed public land when there's not good access to it, right?
Yeah. Right.
So they get engaged and they talk to the land board. Land board ends up voting 5-0 not to do that, right? And so that was that was a grassroots effort that our members on the ground, individuals did, and all we did was like, okay, they tell us it's a problem. Mm-hmm. We're like, well, let's get a petition together. We get this petition that 4,000 people sign, and so not only are they able to use their voices individually at these meetings, but then they're able to put that petition down on the ground and be like, here's 4,000 other people that believe the same. And I think that's what helped influence that whole thing. And then they had their first ever rally, you know, and they brought together, folks from Backcountry Horsemen, you know, and they brought back, I remember I spoke at that and there was a woman that was wearing a t-shirt that said Dirtbag Runner, right? Well, Dirtbag Runner, she uses public lands too, right? And so this rally they had, I think there was like 600 people there, and that was the first time they've really done a public lands rally in Wyoming. And so, it's really empowering, I think, when people do these things. And so those are, I mean, we could go on all day. Yeah. I think when I first got here, you know, we weren't hardly doing any kind of cleanup, you know, efforts. It was all kind of advocacy. And now, I mean, chapters all over this country are having events where they're, you know, we're trying to track that, how many hours they're putting in, but just even that piece is growing within BHA besides the advocacy, which I think is pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's incredible.
Is that boots on the ground?
Yeah. Well, you said this to me years ago. It's great to get some money donated.
Yeah.
It's great to have some funds to work with, but it's the voices and the boots on the ground that really, have that tremendous power.
We're never going to be able to fight, you know, like, I mean, the money that's here to privatize or to exploit is infinitely more than we'll ever have. But what they don't have is they don't have the people. We have the people. When I say we, I'm not talking about BHA. I'm talking about the collective we as like America, right? And like you look throughout history, whether that's in the world or America, exploitation is king, right? Mm-hmm. Well, like we the people have decided we want something different in the United States. And if we're complacent, we're going to be like the rest of the world. But if we stand up, it's going to be different. And I for one want it to be different.
Yeah. There's a lot of education that has to take place. I mean, you hear Senator Mike Lee say, "We the people own Texas." It's like, no, people own Texas, not we the people. Like people do.
Oh, totally.
Totally different scenario, but he preaches we the people.
And it's a play on words, right?
Yeah. I think it's a lie.
Yeah.
Is what it is, too.
Yeah.
I mean, it's flat out a lie.
Land was talking earlier about how lucky we are to be out west, and, you know, largely elk hunting is kind of the pinnacle of a lot of people's perspective of hunts. You referenced the whitetail guy, you know, sitting in a tree stand out in Ohio, and how that could translate into being, you know, an advocate for public lands, getting that chapter opened. And I've got a really good buddy of mine that lives in North Carolina, and he and his buddies have been planning for 3 years to come out and do their first ever archery elk hunt. This year it's happening. You know, they've been studying the Onyx maps. They've kind of picked a general unit in Idaho that they want to kind of go out and explore. But there's no doubt in my mind that at the conclusion of this trip coming up here in September, when he's driving home with his 3 buddies, he will be a stronger advocate and supporter for public lands than he already is right now as somebody who lives out in North Carolina. You know, and that's just another beautiful piece of folks being able to travel around and explore these new wild places.
I got to admit, like when I go to Pennsylvania, you know, shout out to Pennsylvania BHA.
Yeah.
Those people over there don't take for granted the public lands like we do out west.
Yeah.
Like they are seriously awesome. They absolutely just value it because it's so they don't have it.
Yep.
Same with the Texas chapter.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And they're just
Salty
as passionate
totally.
as any chapter of folks I've ever met.
I mean,
the less you have, the more valuable it is.
And I think you brought up North Carolina. That was one of the chapters that came on this last year in April at the Rendezvous. They started a tour of pint nights last night, I think in Asheville, and they're doing this like 5 or 6 nights.
Nice.
They had 75 people last night at New Belgium, like brewery or whatever, you know, like North Carolina, right?
Dang.
So, you know, these guys, they're coming out here and doing this hunt who can go explore and like totally make mistakes. And, you know, hopefully, you know, they get lucky and they bump into something, or they, you know, with skill, they find it. But that's available to anybody in North Carolina that really wants to put in the work, you know, because this stuff is out here doesn't mean it's not attainable, you know.
People always ask about coming out west, and I'm like, literally, guys, you can just buy a tag at the gas station, roll into town, and pick a spot on the map that's public, and just on Google Earth.
What does that mean?
And there's probably going to be elk there. Like, just walk around.
Start walking.
Like, I tell people this. It's not actually.
Been doing that for 20 years, and that's still what I do. Just walk around.
And so
It'd be the title of a good book.
But it's
right.
It's hard to imagine that if you spent some time in places where that doesn't exist, which I have. I've lived in various and worked in places where there is no public land, and this is unique over here.
Absolutely.
So let's wrap this up. To as we come to a close here, I want to kind of just ask each of you to tell me, to tell the audience, what do public lands mean to you? Like, what do they mean to you?
I think Land said it. Like, to me, they're literally everything to me. They're the reason I am who I am. And like Uncle Randy, we're going to throw Uncle Randy's down this whole entire podcast. But like Newberg said, you'll pry those from my dead cold hands. Like, there's no compromise for me on that. Like, literally, I think, and it probably stands for all of us, like, we are who we are because of our public lands and the access we've had to those.
Touching on that, you were talking earlier about voting, being for hunting and fishing. You're a one issues voter, right? Public lands. I think about that, on what you said, Ty, like it's hard for someone principled and has a certain ideal. And if Republican is kind of the way they lean, and there's this moral principle behind voting for that party, to take yourself out of that and vote for another. Right. There's a challenge there. But for me, I have extreme faith in nature, in wild places, and what it does to a person.
Yeah.
I have faith in the idea that if you're a human being that cares about wildlife in a true sense, cares about nature in a true sense, not someone who's like, I like bears because they look cool and they're cuddly, but someone who truly does feet on the ground, value those things. I have tremendous faith in those people, whether they agree with me on other social issues, to be good people.
Totally.
And so I can kind of be like, man, if they're for public lands, and if they're for conservation, and if they're for nature, kind of like, I'm going to roll the dice on that person, because I believe out of that stems all of this like goodness and truth and justice, that maybe we don't agree on all these other things, but I feel like at the heart of that human being, there's something precious there that I can get behind, even though we disagree on a lot of other issues, Republican, Democrat, whatever.
Yeah. And this should be the one that is universal, right? And I think, I don't want anybody to listen to this to think that, that I think, or BHA thinks, that it's only Democrats, that do good things for conservation, because that couldn't be farther from the truth. I think about Congressman Simpson in Idaho and the Boulder White Clouds Wilderness, that he just got done, last Congress. I think about, Cory Gardner up in Colorado, who's the big proponent for land and water conservation. I mean, there's examples like that. I mean, I want people to know that, right? I think that piece. But at the end of the day, and we said this earlier, is that the way you make this a universal thing, where then maybe you're choosing parties on other issues, is by demanding these politicians act a certain way when it comes to public lands and public waters. And I think if we do that, we're in a much better place, and I feel that our legacy is safe. But if this becomes, more and more partisan, I don't think it's safe.
Brian.
Man, for me, I just go back to my childhood and growing up in Oregon, and all the time that I spent with my dad in Eastern Oregon. We bird hunted a ton on some state managed wildlife refuges out of Boardman, Oregon. Grew up with upland hunting, waterfowl hunting, spent all of my youth there. Multiple days a week, we would make the trek from Portland and waking up at 3 a.m, going over there, hunting all day, coming home. And then, as I got a little bit older, exploring the Blues Mountain Range in Eastern Oregon. And that was just where I became, again, like Ty said, who I am today. It's threaded within my DNA. It connects me to not only my dad and my uncle and my family, but to my grandfather that I never had a chance to meet. He was the original hunter of our family. They got my dad into it, then got me into it. And that's just the place that's just so special. And I hope I am able to draw a tag at some point in time and get back there and hunt again, because it just has so many positive memories from the time I was 7 years old until I eventually moved to the state of Utah a few years ago. That is my public lands, That was my mountain growing up.
Yeah.
When I would jump in the truck to go east and drive 6 hours. We were going to our mountain. And that's only a feeling that you get when you have that access to develop those stories, those memories, those connections, and make it feel like you do own it, because you do own it.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
And that is just the most unique thing in the world that I'm super passionate about. I want to continue to see other people find that zone or that spot that they just are so in love with, that they want to keep going back and bring other people. And, ultimately that's kind of what it embodies to me.
Yeah.
Land?
So it's like going to be a me too a little bit, but I'd say freedom, is a word. I think family is a word. I think food is definitely a word. And then I think the last piece that we've touched on is like this word solace. And, I've had some traumatic events in my life, and I think that the public lands and that ability to go out there and kind of let everything else drift away from me, it sounds cheesy, but I think it's saved me, multiple times. And without that, like you say, what would public lands, where would you be without public lands, let's say? And I would, I don't know, I'd probably be dead, to be totally honest. Or I'd be, spiraled out somewhere doing something that, is not healthy for society. And I think, so that solace, that opportunity to recenter. And that's little things like Ty and I were talking about, it's like, I got to go on a backpacking trip with my wife, a couple weeks ago, and we were in the woods for 2 days, without the kids and just like us two, and like that recentering with her, like, man, that meant so much to me. It was only 2 days, and so there's that kind of in my daily life that's super important. But then when I've had traumatic things happen to me, it's really been the public lands that have brought me back.
I think without them, I'd feel like a rat in a cage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
there's an amazing healing power, right, to being out in those wild places. And if you're not fortunate enough to grow up in a family that has a big ranch to go out and, have that, like, that's all you got.
Yep.
That's all we got.
mm-hmm.
My daughter, go ahead.
I would feel trapped.
Yeah.
Today we just climbed this mountain right here. I climb it every week, multiple times a week, and I can just go anywhere. I can do it in a Jeep. I can do it on my feet. I can just spend the night. I can hunt elk. I can hunt deer. I can do ducks. I could just do it.
Yeah.
And it's mine. I can't imagine. I mean, I've been in places like Japan and such where every day is just private property. It's, there's no space to go. And, it can wear you down. I mean, it's soul sucking.
And my daughter, she just came back from Seattle. She was there with her grandmother, and we have family there, and they were hanging out and seeing some really cool stuff. Like Amazon has these big spheres that have like all these different plants from around the world, in them, and like big, huge 40-foot tree that's in the middle of it. Some really cool stuff. But she came back being like, I don't think I could ever live like that. Just constant people, and constant noise and just the hustle and bustle that is more of our society. I mean, we've talked about that, right? Like more and more people are moving into a urban setting. And again, like it was awesome for me to hear, that from her, that she just like, this is not who she is. And no offense to people that live there, there's plenty of amenities, that come with the city. I like Seattle actually as a big town, but one of the reasons I like Seattle as a big town is because it's a place I go visit and I can come back to these public lands, and really get my mind right.
It's every week, I think being stuck behind a desk, the grind of the 9-to-5 life, you just, for me, I start to just get anxious. Like I need to get out and do something. And my wife knows me well enough now. She's like, go, go for a hike, go fishing, get out, go do something.
Building.
Yeah. I mean, it would be hard to fathom the idea of not being able just to go out and do that. And I feel super fortunate to have grown up and lived in places out west that offer that at our back door. And Salt Lake is a great place that literally within minutes you can be hiking on public trails, exploring the Wasatch Front. And
that's what we did today.
That's pretty dang awesome.
We literally, that's what we did today.
Yeah. I would say I heard, Ranella one time addressed by someone who said, something about killing an animal. If you really cared about it, you wouldn't kill it, and he was saying, I care more about like antelope as a species than you do. Can almost guarantee, I care more about them as a species than you do. You care about the one animal, the one that I killed, but as a whole, the idea of antelope existing, I care about those, more than anything.
Right.
If you told Ranella, like, okay, you cannot hunt them the rest of your life. They will be guaranteed to live in perpetuity forever. He's like, would you decide to not hunt? Or would you decide like that's too, like, hunting's more important to you than the actual animal?
Right.
It's like, I would choose every time to not hunt anymore.
Yeah.
Like, I would give up hunting. I look at public lands in that sense. It's like, if you came to me, land, and said, okay, you can never have public lands again, but all the animals and all the wild places will stay in existence forever, I would make that choice. I would say, okay, no more public lands. But I truly believe that public lands are why they exist, and that those wild animals and the wild places, that they would not exist today, and they won't exist in perpetuity if they're not collectively owned by all American citizens. And there's this quote by Theodore Roosevelt, a speech when they laid the cornerstone for the gateway to Yellowstone National Park. This is in 1903. The Yellowstone Park is something absolutely unique in the world, so far as I know. The scheme of its preservation is noteworthy in its essential democracy. This park was created and is now administered for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. The only way that the people as a whole can secure to themselves and their children the enjoyment in perpetuity of what the Yellowstone Park has to give is by assuming the ownership in the name of the nation, and by jealously safeguarding and preserving the scenery, the forests, and the wild creatures. I think that Roosevelt was truly inspired, and those men that helped put public lands in place today that are here. And as is evidenced by the results of it, with the restoration of all the animals and the species we have today, it's working.
Yeah.
I want to see hunters like stand up and defend it, keep it here. To me, public lands is what it means to be American. It's what it means to be human. Having places to hunt and fish and to explore, it goes back to, it's how we human beings came to be. And to replace it with pavement and concrete is just a travesty.
Mm.
It's a road that will end in sadness.
Yeah.
Well, on that happy note,
On that positive note,
I mean, I would say,
I agree.
right? And that's like it's our time to do our part, to make sure that doesn't happen.
yeah,
And guess what? My daughter, who's 10 years old, like her kids and whatever, they're going to have to do the same thing that you and I right now. And the venue might not be a podcast, which, by the way, thank you for taking this to the people.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the more people know, the better. But it's our part, our time to do our part right now. And literally, they did it before us. We know the big names like Roosevelt and Aldo Leopold.
Pinchot and the government. It wasn't comfortable then.
But there's thousands of other people that we don't know their names,
Yeah.
right? They played a part. And so whether, again, that's a small part or a big part, play some kind of part to carry this legacy forward. And I think that is what you're setting up right there.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, guys. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian.
Appreciate
Yeah.
everything.
Thanks, Brian.
Go
Yeah.
out and if you're not a member already, please go and join BHA. If you've got questions, send them emails. Send me emails. Send Brian McElrea emails. Reach out to Hush. As always, thanks for listening to the podcast. Leave us a review if you like it, and if you don't like it,
Do it anyway. 5 stars.
5 stars. All right. Thanks, guys. Stay
Thank
great.
you.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Despite our ever-changing, ever-indignant world with its growing ignorance of and indifference to the ways of the wild, I remain a predator, pitying those who revel in artificiality and synthetic success while regarding me and my kind as relics of a time and place no longer valued or understood. I stalk a real world of dark wood and tall grass stirred by a restless wind blowing across sunlit water and beneath star-strewn sky. And on those occasions when I choose to kill, to claim some small part of nature's bounty for my own, I do so by choice, quickly, with the learned efficiency of a skilled hunter. Further, in my heart and mind, I know the truth and make no apologies for my actions or my place and time. Others around me may opt to eat only plants, nuts, and fruits. Still others may employ faceless strangers to procure their meats, their leather, their feathers, and all those niceties and necessities of life. Such is their right, of course, and I wish them well. All I ask in return is no one begrudge me, and all of us who may answer the primordial stirrings within our hunter souls my right to do some of these things myself. What you just heard is a quote from M.R. James. We truly live in a world that is largely ignorant and indifferent to the ways of the wild. And although some regard us as relics of a time and place no longer valued or understood, we have the opportunity to change the way these people view the hunter and the hunt. We can share our experiences and nature's bounty with those who employ these faceless strangers. And by so doing, we make a difference, not just for ourselves, but for the wild animals in the wild places we care so deeply about. Never stop sharing your passion for hunting and the outdoors. Our wild animals and our wild places depend on it.
This is Ty Stubblefield, and you're listening to The Gritty Bowman.
Gritty Bowman.